The Ethiopian government says that it's ready at any time and at any place to engage in peace talks under the auspices of the African Union. The rebel force, the Tigray People Liberation Front, has also expressed a desire for peace negotiations, but mistrust between it and the government is surfacing yet again as it accuses the government of provoking its forces. The United Nations says that the conflict in the country's north that began in November 2020 has now caused over 9 million people in the region to require humanitarian assistance. Coletta Wanjohi is in Addis Ababa.
A peace committee tasked by the Ethiopian government to guide it towards a peaceful resolution to the conflict in the country's north has come up with what it calls a peace proposal.
Firstly, it proposes for peace talks to happen within the coming weeks towards an agreed ceasefire. Secondly, it proposes to undertake an in-depth political dialogue between the parties leading towards a settlement. And thirdly, it proposes for any other pending issues to be addressed through a national dialogue.
The Tigray People's Liberation Front, the rebel group that the government has been in conflict with for over a year and a half, has expressed mistrust for this announcement. It is blaming the government forces for what it calls provocation of its own forces. It also reiterates its position that the return of basic services to the Tigray region is a must before any talks. But Abiy Ahmed's government says talks must be held without preconditions.
The issue of restoration of services in particular comes up again and again as if there is one single on and off button or switch that is centrally located. This is a particularly dangerous and erroneous view of how service that is disrupted due to conflict and related damage within the region is administered. The government has made it clear on several occasions to partners as well as to the public that the security and administrative arrangements within the Tigray region need to be cleared and put in place to facilitate technical repair work on the ground in Tigray region to restore these saved services.
The UN says the humanitarian situation in the country's north is dire. In the Tigray region alone, where it estimates there are about 6 million people in need, humanitarian supply resumed in April this year after a humanitarian ceasefire was announced by the government in March. The UN says as of 1st August, more than 1.4 million metric tons of humanitarian supplies had arrived in the area. But it says more food and non-food items are needed as soon as possible. Coletta Wanjohi, SABC News, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Well, for a little bit more on this, we're now joined by African security and policy expert Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program. Good to talk to you. It's been a while. All right, you're muted, Abdullahi.
Sorry about that.
Brilliant.
It's rookie mistakes.
So, do you know, as I was reading that introduction, this desire to negotiate peace, this sounds like a conversation that we've had before and it bore no fruit. So is this the same story playing out over and over again where the right things are said, but one wonders if there's sincerity?
I think there are a few things at play here, my brother Peter. Number one, I think both parties, just like regarding the cause of the violence, are having different ideas of how to resolve this. So the Tigray the Tigray Defense Force are saying, before we get into any talks, they say all the services need to be resumed. That includes telecom, banking, as well as unfettered humanitarian access. But for the government, according to the spokeswoman, she's saying that the talks have to start now. The other things are issues that needs to be negotiated. I think it's a little bit disingenuous for her to say that there is no specific button. The government has the power and the machinery to allow for the humanitarian aid to come in. 6 million people in need of humanitarian aid. This is the fourth, and potentially in October, if the rains are below the, below average, we're going into 4 or 5 failed rain season. If you add that, if you add war to that, you are preparing people for a much more severe outcome. So I think it is fair for the Tigray Liberation Army to say, first, let's have all these services resumed. It's not a precondition. They cannot go to a negotiating table when their people are in a very dire humanitarian situation, as other aid agencies have said in the past.
All right. One of the spokespersons of the TPLF, Getachew K. Reda, says the so-called peace committee established by the Abiy Ahmed regime is engaged in its usual game of obfuscation to hoodwink the international community, whilst its forces actively provoke our forces at various fronts. They've openly defied their often repeated promise to take this process forward. So there is a huge trust deficit between these two sides. How does that deficit get managed?
I think as a way of building the trust between the two parties, the most important thing is Tigrayans, regardless of the differences, are Ethiopians as well. Ethiopia has got a very rich history of people dying because of famine. Peter, famine is not natural. Famine is man-made. What is natural about famine is the drought that precipitated, that you don't have control over. If this number of people need humanitarian aid, it is fair, number one, for humanitarian access. I want to make one thing very clear. The humanitarian condition has improved from where it was, but it needs to improve further, all right? Without which, it will be very difficult. You know, I mean, I understand what TDF spokesperson Getachew Reda is saying with regards to this being a musical chair that, you know, both parties are trying to play. TDF is not immune to it as well. But the reality is, the objective reality, doesn't matter whether you're government, it doesn't matter whether you're TPLF, people in the Tigray region need not to die from a preventable cause. You know, journalists do not have, you know, access. Humanitarian groups do not have unfettered access. In fact, even what we are getting are just snippets. They are not material condition on the ground. So absence of that, the side shows that this feels like a sideshow. Secondly, in terms of the peace talks, there are two-track processes that are at play already. There is the Obasanjo-led peace process, which the TDF has expressed its reservation about. And then there is the potential Kenyatta-led process for which TDF has expressed its satisfaction. So I think those processes at some point potentially need to be merged for that to go on. But the conditions on the ground between the two parties that gulf need to be bridged for us to be able to prevent a catastrophe that is going on, not just in the Tigray region, but neighboring region of Amara and Afar as well.
A very affected region, United Nations describing it as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Could it be that Addis Abeba's hand is being forced by this growing humanitarian crisis, and that it could be blamed directly for the people who lose their lives?
There are a few ways to look at that, all right? There is, you know, the international humanitarian laws are very clear. When you deny people's, you know, object indispensable to their life, that includes food, where food is used as an instrument of war, the international humanitarian laws are very clear. Never mind international humanitarian law, Ethiopian laws are very clear with respect to this. If you destroy people's livelihood and lives, and then that leads to their death, you know, that is a disregard for not just international humanitarian law, but also Ethiopian law. UN Security Council resolution is also very, very clear. 714, I think, is very clear with regards to this, where food is used as a weapon of war. So I think the Ethiopian government could be held liable if people die from preventable causes, and it is established in a court of law or elsewhere that they denied those people the objects that are indispensable to their lives. So if, for instance, we take it that is given that Tigrayans' livelihood, Tigrayan agriculture has been destroyed, and subsequently humanitarian aid that is coming into the Tigrayan region is denied, right? Not just directly, but also by allowing, for instance, the humanitarian aid to come into the region, but there is not enough fuel to transport, not just to transport the food from Mekelle, the headquarters of the Tigrayan region, into some of those areas that are highly impacted. That could easily be termed as using of food or hunger as a weapon of war. And international humanitarian law, Ethiopian law, and even African Union framework are very clear with regards to that. So yeah, there could be a case that can be made of that. The only challenge here is that Ethiopia has not signed onto the Rome Statute, so therefore technically they are not part of the ICC. I think that is the only gap that I see from where I sit, Peter.
Earlier on, you mentioned and alluded to the gaps in terms of how the peace process should move forward. But also, I guess there's an issue of outcomes and what would be acceptable to both sides. At the beginning of this conflict, we saw Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed don a uniform and lead the troops to the front line. And he only had one thing in mind, that was to put down the rebellion and bring the Tigrayan people to heel. This has not happened. It's unlikely that he'll ever get that wish. The Tigrayans are probably, I'm thinking, I want to be even more independent of Addis Ababa than ever before. So where do they meet in the middle? What is the middle between these two sides?
I think that is a very important question, Peter, in the sense that we're only 3 months away almost from the second anniversary of this conflict. And that just shows how quick things can degenerate. Here we are talking about a country of over 100 million, 110 million people, the seat of the African Union, a country that is very strategic in the region. Now we are seated here, me and you, over the last 2 years, almost, discussing the possibility of some parts of Ethiopia, seceding from the federal government, and that is very challenging in a region that is already dealing with a lot. The Horn of Africa region is a region that is bedeviled with incessant conflict. We've seen South Sudan seceding from Sudan. We've seen Eritrea seceding from Ethiopia. This would make it a record that Tigray also seceding from Ethiopia. Those are two countries. And the Ethiopians' 1995 constitution is very clear, although the threshold for achieving that is significantly higher, that it might not happen through peaceful way, it might be happening through war. How can we bridge that gap? The main principal way of bridging that gap is, number one, unfettered humanitarian access by the humanitarian agencies to prevent what is clearly more deaths and destruction of the Tigray. That, number two, is lifting of banking, internet, and all that for people to be able to communicate. Because right now, Tigrayans are relying on goodwill. They can't even access money that they have in their bank account. I think the final one, if these two processes are done, and it will not cost the federal government anything, what that does is it will act as a confidence building mechanism. The third one is for the talks to start. And principally within that talk, I think the most important thing is accountability. We cannot just in the name of talks forget about the level of crimes, egregious human rights and humanitarian law violations that we've witnessed, despite limited access. Journalists, human rights groups, humanitarian groups have been able to document really, really egregious human rights violation. I think that is the path forward. But I know the distance between the two parties with regards to this is very limited. But we've got to be honest with ourselves. There is no any other way of unlocking this. Otherwise, they are going back to fighting. Fighting means more misery being visited on the people that are already suffering. So I think the leadership in the country have to make a choice. Access, humanitarian access, banking, and internet, all those will cost at least nothing. It's been 2 years of this, and finally, I think accountability is a very critical part of this discussion moving forward.
And that's where we'll leave it for the time being. Abdullahi, always good talking to you. Thanks so much indeed. Greatly appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Take care.
Okay, that's Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, who's an African security and policy expert, joining us there from Washington, D.C., talking about the situation in Ethiopia.